pruning, sometimes we can increase the airflow or the air circulation within that plant, which can sometimes help us to circumvent issues that we might see, like fungal diseases and things like that. As plants are pulling water up through the root systems, they're releasing them through their leaves, through the stomata, which are openings on the, usually on the undersides of the leaves. And so the air that's immediately surrounding those leaf surfaces is actually a little bit more humid environment. And so we can see sometimes onset of certain diseases that take advantage of those types of situations. So by pruning, sometimes we can open up that plant a little bit to get just some better airflow and circulation through that plant and reduce the incidence of some of those things happening sometimes. One of the big reasons why we prune, although we have to be really careful about this, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is to direct growth. When you prune, you're actually not just taking away portions of a plant. You're not controlling the growth of that plant. A pruning cut actually stimulates growth within the plant. And so when we prune, we're directing growth more than we're reducing the size of a plant or we're eliminating a portion of the plant. Because again, every time you make a pruning cut on a plant, you're stimulating growth. And so you want to control where that new growth is directing. And I'll show you some examples of that a little later in the presentation. Also, sometimes it's to renew bloom or vegetative growth. If we have a plant that maybe isn't as dense as we would like, that we would like more leaves, we can do certain types of pruning cuts to get a nice fuller, denser look to that plant, or to get more blooms to produce on that plant. So those are a couple other reasons why we prune. And it's really important, and we'll talk about this a lot in fruit tree pruning, but you do not get bloom formation, not get blossoms, unless you have light access to portions of the plant. And so we prune sometimes as well so that we have really nice bloom production. And again, I just want to reiterate that, you know, pruning, it doesn't stop growth or it doesn't eliminate growth. It actually stimulates it. But by making good decisions in terms of our pruning cuts, we can direct that growth in the way that we would like the plant to put that growth out. Okay. A couple other reasons for pruning. Aesthetics. We want to have a certain look to that tree and shrub. Sometimes we get into some of these types of pruning decisions, like if we're trying to prune to have a barrier or privacy or something like that, or if we want it to take on a certain form or look. Risk reduction. So of course, any broken or dying limbs can fall. We certainly know that. We had a mammoth windstorm this past year. And I actually thought it was really interesting driving around Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, and looking at what trees failed, what trees fell over, and then also ones that had a lot of, you know, broken limb damage and things like that. And if you were kind of investigative when you were looking at some of those trees, you might notice that there were a lot of common actors. A lot of the same species of trees had the most branches down, or that fell the most often, and some of those types of things. And so certainly risk reduction, anything that is low hanging, of course, we don't want any head hazards out there. So that's another reason why we're pruning, to get the scaffolds up off the ground, and so that we can do whatever it is that we're trying to do underneath the tree. If you have if you're able to go to the Jordan Valley Conservation Garden Park at some point in time, I encourage you to really look at how they have decided to do a lot of their pruning cuts on trees around the garden. In particular, if you look in the patio area, you'll see how they raise the canopy of those trees so that people could walk, or if they're driving with golf carts or things like that around the patio area, that there's clearance for that. So we do a lot of pruning that way as well. Okay, when is the best time to prune trees and shrubs? Well, for most trees and shrubs, the best time is during their dormant period. And I would say that is just right about now. Actually, we're talking about February, March. And there are several reasons for this. One reason is that it's really easy to see all the limbs, all the branches, because with our deciduous trees and shrubs, so the trees and shrubs that are losing their leaves in the fall time, dropping their leaves in the fall time, our vision is not obstructed by that foliage on that plant. So we can really see the form of the plant. We can easily see what we're doing. It's a lot easier to physically get up into the canopy of trees or you know, get down into the middle of big bushy shrubs this time of year. Dormant cuts are going to stimulate new growth in that plant. And so the plant is kind of just finishing up, going through its dormant period where it's kind of almost in a resting state. It has sunk a lot of its resources down into its root system, a storage ready for new growth in the springtime when the correct weather conditions arrive, that it starts pushing out new foliage. So it's a good time because the plant is just kind of at a natural resting period anyway. And so if you're going to be doing pruning, alterations on it, then the plant, it's a good time for the plant to kind of accept that. I really want to make sure that I emphasize, though, that plants don't like to be pruned. Pruning is wounding a plant. You are physically wounding that plant. Trees and shrubs don't heal, they seal. They compartmentalize off damage. And when you make a pruning cut, you are damaging that plant. Now, there are, of course, a lot of reasons why we do prune, and it's appropriate to prune. But that's another reason why it's a good time to prune in the dormant season, because it gives ample time for those trees and shrubs to be able to seal off those cuts prior to when we see a lot more incidents of insects and disease floating around the environment. So they kind of have that chance to heal themselves off before there's a lot of pressure that way. You want to prune plants that bloom after Memorial Day during the dormant pruning, because we'll talk about summer pruning here in a minute, because summer blooming plants form flower buds in the spring, and so we have good blossom generation. We're not basically pruning off our blossoms for that year. Now, summer pruning is done after a tree or shrub blooms. And these are these are plants that are setting their flower buds in the springtime. Things like forsythia, beauty bush, currant, chokecherry, lilac, mock orange, nine bark, Oregon grape. I obviously have a list here: potentilla, serviceberry, spirea, viburnums. So early blooming trees and shrubs, these are plants that are blooming before Memorial Day. And you prune these types of plants right after they're done blooming. And the reason why we wouldn't want to prune these during the dormant period is because we would obviously be pruning off the flower buds for that year. It's not particularly harmful to the plant. The plant can accept that pruning during the dormant period just fine. It's just we want that nice showy blooms for that year. And so that's why the appropriate time to prune these early blooming trees and shrubs is right after they bloom, so more in the summertime. Okay, I'm just going through a little bit of terminology here, and this is if you're staying for fruit tree production as well, or fruit tree pruning, this is going to be really important that you get some of this basic terminology down. We won't make this too complicated, but we'll come back to this a lot. You have the leader, which is the main trunk or trunks. Sometimes we have multiple leaders. We have scaffolds, which are these main branches that are coming off of a leader. Water sprouts are upward vertical growth that we find in the canopy of the tree. A lot of times people call these suckers. These are not actually suckers if they're up in the canopy of the tree. They're suckers if they're emerging from the root system. They're called water sprouts if they're up in the canopy of the tree. And of course, suckers are the shoots that are coming out of the root system. They are latent buds. They are not really supposed to sprout. We'll talk about with fruit trees how we get a lot of suckering and we get a lot of water sprouting. And honestly, that is because we intensively prune fruit trees so much. But in landscape trees, this is more of a sign of stress in the tree. We'll get water sprouts sometimes, for example, if there's a little bit of damage to a branch or something like that, or suckers, the same thing if the tree is stressed. then it will start sending up suckers from its root system. So it's not necessarily a good thing to be seeing these in the landscape. And if you are seeing them in the landscape, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit more during Q&A, there's typically some sort of a reason why that plant is stressed and why those are popping up. So it's a good indication that you maybe need to look into the overall health of that particular plant. Okay, so some of our pruning tools that we utilize, starting off, we have to have really good plant knowledge. What plant is it? I really want to reinforce today that you have to have a healthy respect for plant genetics. It's really important to know how that plant wants to grow. How tall does it ultimately get? How wide does it ultimately get? What is the overall form of the canopy of that plant? Does it tend to be a plant that likes to have multiple leaders or just one leader? I really am an advocate for not doing much pruning in the landscape. I want to take yard work away from you, have you do less. I call that garden smarter, not harder. And that really starts with planting the right plant in the right place. We obviously all, as we purchase homes or move or things like that, inherit plants sometimes that are too big, overgrown, these different sorts of things. And sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to manage those plants throughout the year. And that's okay, that's fine, but just realize that there are other choices out there. So if you have a spot in your landscape that you plant that's about 5 feet, a plant that's about 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide would perfectly fit that spot, then purchase a plant that gets to be about 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide at maturity, not one that gets 8 to 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide, because you're going to have to do a lot of pruning on that plant because the plant genetics are just going to tell that plant over and over and over again, this is how big I ultimately want to get. So I highly encourage that you think about what you're planting and where it's going, and if there's room for it, it's going to be a good spot for that plant. How does it grow? What is its function? So those are some of the questions we're asking. One of our most important pruning tools actually is our hands. People don't do this very often, and you really should probably consider doing it more. We'll talk about this with fruit tree pruning. This is really important, but we can constantly be kind of walking around our yards and gardens and looking at our plants. If we're noticing things like water sprout formation up in the branches of the tree, when the water sprouts are just coming on, they're really easy to pinch off with your fingers. And that's actually a lot healthier for the tree down the road, because then you're not having to come in and do that wounding cut to remove that water sprout later. So pinching off any suckers or water sprouts, kind of constantly monitoring that with your hands. Also, if you're noticing any pests, you can pick those off. You can take around a little bottle of alcohol with you to put those in to kill those pests. And yes, our hands are really important tools for pruning as well. When we get into larger size branches, so we're looking at anything from about a 1/2 inch diameter down, then an appropriate tool would be a pair of shears, of hand shears. We would prefer, or we would recommend that you purchase a good pair of bypass pruners. That's what you're looking at here, where you have the 2 blades that are bypassing one another, as opposed to Anvil pruners. Anvil pruners kind of have a crushing effect, where bypass pruners make a much cleaner cut. And again, remember, you're wounding the plant when you're pruning it, and so keeping that cut as clean as possible is really important. Want to make sure that we're keeping our tools sharp. So sharpeners are important to clean a little steel wool, help clean them up, and that they're nicely adjusted, that they're just making that nice clean cut. So the golden rule with pruning is that if you're sweating or swearing, you're not using the right tool. So this is a little too hard to take off that branch at that diameter, and then you need to move up to the next. Oops, I'm sorry, that's the Anvil pruners, what those look like. We don't recommend using those. Then you need to move up to using loppers, and these can handle a little bigger branches. I really like loppers. Loppers are a little bit harder because sometimes it's hard to get them in to tight spaces in trees and shrubs. But you're looking at about an inch and a half diameter and down would be appropriate for a good pair of loppers. Again, we would recommend this bypass blade, keeping them sharp and clean and tightened. I don't typically recommend head shears. I know they're easy and they're quick, and certain things that we're doing in the landscape, they can be appropriate. But it's kind of, I don't know, I guess it kind of depends on how much time you want to spend on your pruning job. It's kind of like going and getting a haircut. If you really just want to get in and out and you're cool with a 5-minute haircut and, just whatever it looks like is whatever it looks like, then there you go. But I like to go in and get the 45-minute haircut and have a little bit more detail in my and how my hair is being cut. And so with head shears, it's kind of quick. It can take off soft growth, uniform size. We use this a lot for very formal landscape pruning jobs. Definitely want to keep these sharp and clean, but they do have a kind of a ripping effect. And I want to come back to this a little later because ultimately you get usually a decline in the foliage density in the plants, just because you're just kind of taking off the new growth on the top. And you're not creating light pockets down into the plant to generate new growth coming from down below. So these have, in my opinion, these don't have a very natural look when you use these types of tools. And so I like the more natural look, and it's a little bit healthier, I think, on plants too, by doing some of these other types of cuts that we'll talk about here in a minute.
Hey, Katie.
Yes.
We have a couple questions that have come in, if you're okay for those.
Okay.
Do you have any brand or model recommendation on the pruners, on the bypass pruners? Maybe one.
I don't, but you get what you pay for. So get a good pair. Get a splurge a little bit, spend a little bit more on them, and get a good pair. But I don't have a specific brand or model.
Okay.
There are a lot of good ones out there.
And then someone has some shrubs that they want to relocate this spring. Should she not prune them now if she plans on relocating them?
That's a good question. I would probably recommend, that might be a good thing for us to kind of talk about specifically what type they are. I mean, it's really hard to generalize, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. But it kind of depends on the situation, the scenario. But in general, I would say, because when you are pruning, you are stimulating new growth. If you are getting ready to kind of disrupt that plant, you're getting ready to move it, I would try to take as much of the root mass as possible, relocate that plant. I don't think that I would prune it because I wouldn't really want to stimulate new growth right now. New growth is going to come at the expense of energy that's stored in the root system. And that plant is going to need that energy to grow additional roots because you are inevitably going to be breaking some roots when you're trying to move and relocate that plant. If you needed to come back, if you moved it and relocated it and then you had some branch dieback, that sort of a thing, then by all means prune that out when you see it. But I don't know that I would do it prior to trying to move it. So
sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, you bet. All right, good questions. Okay, this is one of my favorite pruning tools. This is the handsaw, and everybody should have one of these. This is one that I would not say get the top model on. Because it's really difficult to sharpen these. So get a cheaper one, and then when it gets dull, donate it and buy a new one. But handsaws are really great. You can fit into tight little spots a lot of times with them. Try to find one that has that curved blade. I think that really helps sometimes in getting around branches inside shrubs. And these are nice too because they cut with the push and the pull. And so you get really a lot of cutting action with them, and you can attack some larger sized branches with these. You should keep them sharp and clean, but again, I go a little bit less expensive on these, and then I just purchase a new one when my old one is getting dull. And I am not going to talk about chainsaws because I don't want for folks to be getting in over their heads. If you're dealing with a branch that has a diameter that is necessary to be taken off by a chainsaw, and I'll show you an example of how we do cutting systems here in a minute. You're dealing with a pretty substantial branch, and that's a lot of weight. So if you're getting into that kind of terrain, you may want to consider having a certified arborist come out and take a look at that, see if they can't handle that for you, because you can get in over your head pretty quickly. Okay, some different types of cuts here. First one I want to talk about is a heading cut. And this is where, as you can see on this picture, maybe you can see my mouse here, where you're tipping the ends of branches. Oftentimes you cut just above a bud. So you can see this picture here, this bud. We're making the cut actually in the same direction as the bud, just above it. I would say about 1/4 inch above that bud. This is where we were talking about the directional growth, okay? So as this bud leaves dormancy and emerges and grows a new branch, it is going to grow a branch. It's going to throw that growth this direction. So I have some choices in terms of the direction in which I want for this plant to continue growth. It could be, if I did it at this bud up here, it would be a branch that's growing out this direction. If I did it this bud here, it'd be a branch that's growing out this direction. So this is where we can get into the terrain of directing growth, determining where we want that plant to grow. So what happens when we do this heading cut is we force buds to break dormancy just below where we made that cut. Not that it's all that important, but maybe it's interesting. The reason why that's happening is because of hormones inside the plant, okay? But we get that growth just below where we made that cut, and the response is we get fuller and, excuse me, bushier growth. And this is used with hedging. Sometimes we also hear, where we use it with hedging. And so if we're trying to get kind of a denser kind of foliage right on the exterior of the plant, we can do a series of these heading cuts and we'll get kind of a flush of growth happening right below where we made that cut. Try to randomize this at different lengths. That's going to give a much more natural appearance, okay? Instead of just having it perfectly going, unless that's the look that you're looking for, do it at different lengths, and you'll get a nice natural appearance to that shrub. And again, this is the heading cut. You kind of see the before. This is what you could expect to see. You could see that's where that cut was made there. And these buds are breaking dormancy just below, giving a fuller look to that plant. You do not want to do this. This is topping. And we never top. We never should top. Topping is never appropriate. This is where we're getting in these large diameter branches in the canopy of this tree. We are cutting them, and then we get this big flush of growth, all these latent buds that were dormant inside that canopy now are breaking that dormancy because of hormones, because of that topping cut. And what we get is a lot of water sprouting. We get very weak branch angles. We'll get a lot of branches breaking. It's ugly. It's extremely unhealthy for the tree. So again, this kind of comes back to, if you have a tree that's too large for a place, it's for a particular location, it's inappropriately placed. Topping is not the answer for trying to reduce that height in that tree. We should try to avoid that. So don't do that. Okay, this is my favorite cut here. These are called thinning cuts. And thinning cuts are where we're taking the cut, or we're removing back to kind of a natural junction. And this is actually where we are removing parts of the plant. Because what we don't tend to see with thinning cuts, we don't tend to see a flush of growth right at, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse to behave here. We don't tend to get a flush of growth right below that cut like we got with the heading cut. Instead, the growth is going to be kind of thrown to the growth that is associated with what is just below it and moving up into this, this branch that already exists, okay? So the response is that the branch will not grow back. And so it's the least invigorating type of a cut. It also gives a very natural appearance. One thing that we definitely want to avoid is ever making a cut. If we're making a heading cut, we're always cutting back to just above a bud. We never want to make a cut where, for example, say we made a cut here just above the junction, but quite a bit above the junction, leaving a little stub. That's a cut that we want to avoid. That looks very unnatural. It's actually pretty unhealthy for the plant as well. So heading or thinning, you have to choose. Are you cutting back to a bud or are you cutting back to a natural junction? And this is what you could expect to see. So say we have a shrub here that's just, you know, a little bit too bushy, a little too much going on here. We want to make it thin it out a little bit. We want to get better airflow through the canopy. Then we're making decisions here with our thinning cuts so that we have kind of this more open appearance and look. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so many of us have seen this before. This is obviously problematic, and what I'm pointing out specifically is that you have that tearing wound in that tree. And so I want to show you, if you are taking off larger branches, how we would recommend doing that. It's something called the 3-cut system. And our first cut happens so we're actually looking at, for that first cut, we're looking at this one here. You come out about 6 to 12 inches from the leader of that tree, and you cut about halfway through that leader, about halfway through the diameter, okay? You're cutting from the bottom up. You're not cutting all the way through. Our second cut that we're coming in and doing is here, and this is, we're coming out a little bit further, and we're cutting down. And this is to remove this portion of the tree or the large shrub, which has a lot of weight to it. So if for some reason we do get some tearing action that occurs as this portion of the tree starts to fell, this is also a good way that you can, when it's starting to come down, you can get away from that plant quickly and avert any sort of danger to yourself. The tearing is going to stop where you made this first cut, where you made that cut 1. So let's see. Oops, sorry. So cut 1 is underneath, about 6 to 12 inches out. Cut 2 is just to remove that weight further down. And then cut 3, we are doing here at right next to the leader or next to the trunk. But we're doing it outside of what we call the branch bark ridge, which is the top portion, and the branch collar. It's a natural swelling point. It's transition between trunk tissue and branch tissue. And we want to keep it just outside. It's slightly angled upward, as you can kind of see, kind of at a slight angle. And the reason why we do that, and we don't do a flush cut like we can see over here, this would be a flush cut. We want to avoid that. Instead, to make that proper cut, we're doing it at a little bit of an angle, and we're leaving it outside of the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, so kind of these natural swelling points. And the reason why we do that is because then the tree is at the best, has the best ability to seal off and compartmentalize that damage. It'll actually start to form cork cambium around that wood. And it happens more quickly that way because you have made it so that the tree is able to come in and seal off and that damage. And honestly, down the road too, you will never see that pruning cut because basically the tree kind of compartmentalizes it, and it becomes inside the cork cambium and not visible anymore. And so aesthetically, it has a really nice look to it as well. Again, this is kind of hard to do virtually. I apologize. I wish I could just show you out in the garden. But if you have any questions on that, I'm certainly happy to help with that.
Hey, Katie, I actually have a question that's come in about the tearing of the branch. So the question is, if you didn't know about the 3-cut system and had some tearing when you cut off a branch, is there anything you can do to help the tree now that it has that tear?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can clean up a little bit around that tear, but you should not put anything on it. And actually, there are products sold specifically. They'll be wound sealers and things like that. Don't use them. The plant has already had the damage done. It is going to do its job now of trying to compartmentalize off that damage. You don't want to interfere with that process at all. So unfortunately, if the tearing has happened, you can clean up that tear a little bit, but at this point forward, you want to just leave it alone and not put anything on it.
Sounds good. Maybe one more question real quick here. This
Sure.
has more to do with shrubs. The question is cutting into the brown of the shrub a bad thing? I assume maybe the inner portion of the shrub. How do you make an overgrown shrub much smaller?
Okay, yeah, and we're going to talk about this. Actually, that's a slide coming up. So let's deal with that when we get there. Perfect. Okay. All right. So you want to choose the right cut. Here we have some hedging and shearing kind of taking place. That can work sometimes for densely foliated plants, but some of these plants here that kind of have a more sort of a loose growth to them, this is not going to be an appropriate plant type to try to hedge and shear. So you have to make those kinds of decisions. Let's look at some specifics here. Okay, so where do we start? I'm going to go through this quickly because I think this probably should be pretty obvious, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We can talk a little bit more and answer your questions at the end. Anything that's dead, you can remove it. You can remove it anytime, okay? If it's dead, get it off. That could be in the summertime, it can be in springtime, wintertime. Whenever you see it, just get it out of the plant. A lot of times, kind of a couple indications. Well, you can tell if a limb is dead. Sometimes there's a color discoloration to that limb, and you can see the dead branches that way. Another way that you can test actually is if you have a sharp knife or a sharp tool, maybe your hand shears with you that are sharp, you can scrape the bark, and if you have green right under where you have scraped that bark, then that's living tissue. So you would not want to prune that off. It's not dead. If it's just brown, and especially if it's really, really hard and it's brown, then that's an indication that it has died and you could go ahead. Also, if it's really brittle, and usually it's dead. Living branches they have a little bit of flexibility to them. Anything diseased kind of can come out anytime. I'm actually really glad that Sheridan put this picture here in the middle, because this is one I want to talk about a little bit. This comes into fruit trees as well, but let's talk about it here in more depth. This is fire blight. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that attacks members of the rose family. And actually the rose family is huge. It's not just roses. And roses actually we don't typically see, fire blight damage on. But we do see it a lot of times in apples and pears, which are in the rose family. And some other ones would be like pyracantha, hawthorn, cotoneaster, mountain ash, and crab apples. Those are all part of the rose family. And this is a disease that typically enters through the blossoms. It happens in the springtime when the correct conditions are around. It is vectored either with splashing water or with insects. And it moves its way down through the branch. And ultimately, this can be a lethal disease for this plant. So what we recommend with fire blight is that you prune out these diseased portions. You actually want to go down about 8 to 10 inches below where you're seeing the diseased portion of the plant. And you actually want to get a bucket out there with 10% bleach solution. And you want to dip your pruners for about 10-15 seconds in between pruning cuts in that 10% bleach solution. And just remove, don't let those branches fall on the ground and leave them there. Like put them in a trash bag and throw them in your trash can. Remove those diseased plant parts from your landscape. So anything that you see is disease. And I guess the reason why I bring that up is fire blight is one common one that we see. And it can be lethal to the plant. It probably will be lethal to the plant if it isn't dealt with, and so it's an important one to remove. And it's one that we see in a lot of different plants in the landscape. I just wanted to point out, and maybe Sean, you can help me out with this, that we have a really nice site, utahpests.usu.edu. Maybe you can put that in the Q&A or the chat, however you want to do that.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, utahpests.usu.edu, and it's a site that is going to help you to figure out what these different pests and diseases are in the landscape and how to control them. And so it's a really great site to educate yourself on, to know what it is that you're looking at and what to do about it. Okay, and of course, anything that's broken, we want to get that off as well. Wounds, branch breaking, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, tearing, I know I had the question before, is there anything I can do now? Those sites are really great sites for insect pests and pathogens to enter into trees and shrubs. So if you have the ability to prune out some sort of a broken limb or that sort of a thing, then you want to definitely do that. Anything crossing or rubbing. Remember, these limbs are just going to get wider and wider and wider, increase their diameter over time, and eventually they're going to grow together. And this creates points of weaknesses, which can be a really big problem later. So anything that's crossing, you just have to make a decision in terms of which crossing branch you want to be taking out, but you should remove them. Okay, really important as well. We'll talk about this a lot with fruit tree pruning, but you want good light into the canopy. And of course, we get the most light here right at the top of the canopy. This is where we get 60 to 100% full sun. But as we get down into these lower portions in the canopy, we get less and less and less light. And so the question there is, can you get light into that tree and shrub? And again, sometimes opening that canopy up a little bit with some pruning cuts can help us to get better light down into the canopy. This isn't as important, I think, as is very, very important with tree fruit production. So I think we'll probably focus on it mostly there. Isn't as important with just some of your landscape trees and shrubs, but still is a consideration in terms of flower production, big consideration in terms of fruit production. Okay, anything that's water sprouts or suckers, take it out. You should remove it. Very weak branching angle, doesn't contribute to good tree form. They're not particularly attractive, doesn't really produce blooms or fruit. And yeah, so go ahead and get those out of there. Okay, couple different strategies here. And this kind of gets into the question that we had before about size reduction, maybe of a plant that's gotten a little bit too big. This is a type of pruning called renewal pruning. We do this in multi-stemmed shrubs, especially with overgrown shrubs. And this is where we're going in and we're removing the oldest and the largest, and by largest I mean the ones with the largest diameter branches each year. It says 3 to 5. You can do more than 3 to 5. Let me give you an example, because I don't really like this picture too much. This picture doesn't tell me a whole lot. But say you purchased a home, you have a lilac shrub in your newly purchased home that is, let's say it's 12 feet tall. And it's too tall, you don't like the height of it, it's getting too close to the house, and you want to reduce the size of that plant. Well, of course, you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that plant should have never been planted there in the first place because it wasn't the appropriate size for the plant that fits that spot. But you like it, you want to keep it, it gives you some good privacy. Okay, what can we do at this point? So, you never want to take more than 1/3 of the branches in a single year, no more than 1/3. Plants store a lot of resources in their branches, and if you take more than 1/3, you're really kind of stressing that plant out. So no more than 1/3. It could be 3 to 5. It could be more if it's a larger size shrub. But again, you want to select those largest and those oldest branches, and you take them down all the way down to the base. And you can see now you're really opening up the that shrub. You're getting a lot better airflow. You are removing a lot of that density throughout that shrub. Okay, so here's another before and after. You're really opening it up. It gives a very natural look to that shrub. Oftentimes those oldest and those largest branches are the tallest branches as well. So we have the question about height reduction. That's the way to do height reduction. Also, you get really nice light penetration down to the base of the plant. And what we're going to see at that point in time is our renewed growth is going to start, because we're getting these light pockets down to the base of the plant. Our renewed growth is going to start occurring here at the base of the plant. So throughout the plant, we're going to get kind of a denser look to that plant over time. So this is kind of one of those where you have to kind of strategize, and you have to hold back a little bit and have a little bit of self-restraint, where if you have a plant that's really big that's gotten out of control, this may be something that's going to take you 2, 3, even 4 years to be able to really get to all of those larger and older branches. But you select which ones you want to take each year, and you kind of keep chipping away at it, and eventually you will get there. So hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, I can answer any questions on that, but renewal pruning is a really great way. And this is something that you really probably should be doing anyway. So typically our older and our larger branches are the ones that are more susceptible to insect pests and disease. So it's actually pretty healthy for a lot of shrubs like this, woody shrubs, to kind of be constantly regenerating new growth. So it's something you should be doing anyway, even if it is appropriately sized plant for your landscape. Do it for health reasons for that shrub.
Hey, Katie, there's a question that's come in related to this. Is it recommended to do this renewal trimming for small and new shrubs? I planted some last fall that would benefit, but they are pretty small.
Yeah, so again, if you have some small shrubs, well, okay, I guess, again, it's hard because it's so hard to generalize. It's so kind of, it's so specific to, this is why I like to walk the garden, and we will do this again next year. Please come back next year and we'll do the garden walk, and we'll do this talk that way, which I think is a really great way to be able to show. But if it is a really small shrub, I guess my question back would be, why does it need to be pruned? Or does it need to be pruned? This is more of a technique that we're doing for older shrubs because we need to get some height reduction. We need to get some size reduction. We need to open up that canopy so we have better air circulation, airflow. We want to get more light penetration down to the base of the plant, so we have a denser kind of foliation production happening throughout the shrub. We want to maintain the health of the plant, so the older limbs, larger limbs tend to have more disease, insect pest vulnerability. With a very small shrub, I don't really see that plant fitting into any of those reasons. And so you could do this, I guess, but I don't know that you would really need to. And any newly planted plant in the landscape, except fruit trees, we'll talk about that. They're the exception. But except fruit trees, pretty much any newly planted landscape plant really has a lot of growing initially, especially underground, especially with its root system. It really needs to be utilizing the leaves that it has to photosynthesize, to generate stored sugars, to be able to grow new roots underground. Again, remember, pruning stimulates growth. And so you're asking that plant to put a lot of energy in the above ground portions of the plant. Sometimes it's better just to let that plant just kind of hang out in the landscape for a while and build up its root mass. And so it, you're not asking it to grow in a place where it doesn't need to grow at the deficit of the place where, or at the, where it really should be putting on that growth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Maybe at the end we can talk about that a little bit more if it's a specific kind of a situation, but
yeah, and there's a few questions that have come up for specific plants, but I think we can cover those at the end.
Don't prune if you don't have to prune. You don't have to prune. I'm giving you a hall pass here. You don't have to do as much yard work. If it's not necessary to prune, then don't. Leave it alone, and that's nice. So, okay, I'm gonna keep moving here. Okay. So again, you want to purchase plants. You want to plant plants that have the desired form and shape that you're looking for, because naturally the genetics of the plant tells it that, because that's going to be a lot easier to maintain that form in the landscape. You should never really, unless you're doing a lot of topiary things or that sort of thing, you should never really have a plant that you have to really, really heavily prune to maintain that shape. That's hard on you, and it's not terribly healthy for the plant. So a few cuts should help to direct the growth that you're looking for, or maintain that shape, not lots and lots of heavy pruning. Okay, some cuts don't grow back. That's true. This is, I guess, she put this in here to be kind of funny, but I think she also was probably referring to the fact that for some of our things, conifers, for example, pines, spruces, things like that. Also some of our woody perennials, sage, rosemary, some of those types of plants, lavender. You never want to prune below the green growth. You always want to make sure that you're staying above the green growth, or sometimes you can get further dieback on that plant. So anyway. Okay, so rule of thumb, you never remove more than 1/3 of the wood in a tree or shrub. We talked about the renewal pruning. If you have larger, older trees and shrubs, or shrubs in this particular case, you take out 1/3, or she says here 3 to 5 of the oldest canes removed annually. And pruning out the oldest canes in the shrub helps to keep the shrub open, and it also helps to keep it smaller. I also wanted to just add to this for just a second, and then I'm just going to kind of show you a few of her funny little pictures that she has, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I want to talk about some common mistakes that I see out in the landscape. My first common mistake is people leaving stubs, and we talked about that earlier. You need to make a decision of what you want to prune back to. But if you're doing a heading cut, you're pruning back to a bud. You're pruning just above that bud. You're pruning at the same angle that that bud is emerging from the stem. The plant is in turn going to throw growth in the direction of the direction in which that bud is pointing. Okay. Or you're doing a thinning cut. You're pruning back to a natural junction. Okay. And then the plant is going to throw growth back to that stem or that branch that's right underneath where you made that cut. Or you're doing a renewal pruning, where you're actually pruning that larger branch all the way back down to the ground. But again, the growth is regenerated. It grows from the base of the plant, and you get that denser, fuller look. You're also doing that for some height reduction, because those bigger, older branches tend to be the tallest. Do you see what I'm saying with that? After every one of those, I said, here's where you're pruning to, and then this is where the growth goes in the plant afterwards. So that's the directional growth, right? You're going to stimulate growth when you make pruning cuts. You're not just taking away plants apart. You always have to think about what's going to be the plant response to me making that cut. So we don't want to leave stubs. Okay, we're always pruning back to something. I like thinning instead of shearing. If you have something like laurels or boxwood or something like that you want to do a little bit of height reduction, maybe have them as kind of a formal component in your landscape. Maybe it's along a sidewalk or, walkway or something like that. That's going in and making periodic thinning cuts at different lengths down into, again, I wish I could show you this out in the garden. We'll do it next year. Come back, I promise. But you're making those thinning cuts back down to those natural junctions. You're creating those little light pockets that now can penetrate down into the plant. You're not going to see them. When you're walking next to your plant, you're not going to see where you made that cut. They're hidden. But you get light pockets down into that plant, and you're going to get some of that foliage regeneration down below the surface of the plant. I personally prefer that over shearing. Okay. Pruning too hard. So Sheridan had that picture of some cuts you just can't go back on. Make sure that we talked a little bit about conifers, lavender, sage, some of those types of plants that you are pruning above. You're leaving that you're pruning green, down to green. You're not pruning below green. So always make sure you're seeing green and don't prune below. Actually, I'll say that with grasses too, ornamental grasses. I like to hold off and really cut those back in the springtime. Sometimes people shear them too hard. Grasses actually grow from the crown of the plant, which is right at the soil surface, not underground, the root system. So I like to see a little bit of that green growth emerging from the crown of the plant. And then when I'm making my cut back to cut the grass that has turned brown over the dormant period, I make sure that I cut that back above where I see that green, so I'm not cutting into that crown. Not respecting the plant's genetics. Making sure that you're picking the right plant for the right place. Does it have the form, the shape that you want? Does it have the correct height, the correct width? Are you physically planting it, placing it in a place where it has the ability to reach its mature height and spread without the necessity of having heavy pruning to keep it that way? So really paying attention, knowing what the plant genetics are, how that plant wants to grow is really important. And that's garden smarter, not harder. That's gonna make it a lot easier for you down the road, because you're gonna have to do a lot less pruning. Remember, I'm getting you out of yard work. This is a good thing. So really respecting the plant genetics is really, really important for me. And then improper placement. When my son brushes his teeth, I have a 7-year-old, we go up, down, side to side, side to side, side to side, front, back, side to side. And same thing with planting plants. You need to look up, you need to think about down, you need to look side to side, and just making sure that you're giving that plant adequate space. It's the appropriate placement of that plant, that it can reach its mature height spread. It's not going to grow in power lines. It's not going to be a hazard in terms of people, hitting their head on scaffolds, trying to walk underneath it. Those different types of considerations. So just being really smart about that. All plants are cute in the nursery when they're babies, but they all grow up. And so when they are grown, they should fill into their environment, into their space, without you having to do a lot of pruning to try to maintain them and keep them at a certain form or size. So with that, I'm just gonna, she's got some funny pictures in here. I mean, this is just, wow. That's a lot of maintenance. This is topping. We talked about that. And look at the growth response from that topping. All of those water sprouts that are popping out of there. Those are all very weakly branched, not particularly beautiful, not healthy for the tree. That tree at this point in time, there's nothing that you could do to correct it. You need to just take it down and replant something that's appropriate. It doesn't get, obviously, that looks like that tree. It's hard to tell, but I guess that tree is probably a 20-foot tree or so. I'll plant a crabapple, a persistent fruit crabapple that gets a mature height of 20 feet instead of that tree. It's going to look a lot better and be a lot healthier. Okay. And again, topping's not good. I think somebody did that just to be goofy. Anyway. Okay. She's got some good ones in here. Wow. Japanese botanical garden. All right, so I have about 15 minutes, I think, and I would be thrilled to answer any sort of personal questions that you guys might have or make any clarifications.
Okay. Yeah, looks like we've got a bunch that have come in here. Let me get back to the top here. The question is, do roses count as shrubs? Should we?
Ooh, roses. Yes, roses definitely do count as shrubs.
The question, the specific question, Katie, is should we do renewal trimming on them as well?
Roses are kind of their own. Okay. You can do whatever you want to do in your landscape. What we find sometimes as horticulturalists is there are the things that we're trained on how to properly prune plants. You don't necessarily have to prune them that way. We'll talk about that in fruit tree production. I want to talk specifically about roses, but I will talk about that particularly in fruit tree. You can have an apple tree that's a shade tree in your landscape, and that's fine. You don't have to prune an apple tree for fruit production if you don't want to. So there's always those decisions to be had. There are different types of roses. I am guessing that the person's asking the question is probably referring to hybrid tea rose. It's one of the most common forms of roses that we see in the landscape. And with horticulture training, here's what they would tell you in terms of pruning those. But just keep in mind, you don't have to do this, okay? It's totally up to you. Roses are very unique. We do what's called a open vase or open center pruning technique. We'll talk about that in fruit tree production as well for any of you that stay. This is kind of the same concept. But basically you have kind of a bowl-like pattern that you create where you don't have canes emerging from the center of the plant. There's kind of a center point, and then you have your canes that are coming out of that center point. You can select, I would say, probably your top 3 to 5 best canes coming out of that center point, okay? And you leave that center open. As you get new growth that tries to grow back, you get buds that break dormancy, try to grow back into that center, into that open center, you remove those, okay? So basically you're pushing all of your growth kind of outwards in a bowl-like shape, and that's going to help you to get really good air circulation through that plant. It's also going to help you to have really a lot of light penetration. We talked about the importance of light to those canes, and that's what's going to really help you get really awesome blossom production, flower production in your rose plants. One thing I will say, and roses are just, like I said, I don't like to generalize because there's always exceptions. You get in trouble when you start generalizing. Roses are definite. So this is kind of funny that we had the question earlier. They said, what if I have some tearing on my tree, a branch that tore its way down the trunk a little bit? Is there anything I can do? And I said, no, absolutely not. You don't put anything on it. You don't seal it with anything. You do with roses, but roses are the only ones. After you make the cut, or when you're making your cuts and you're choosing. So I guess I should say too with roses, and again, this is hard to do virtually, and we could go into a lot more detail, but you have your 3 to 5 main canes. They're coming out kind of open center. And then you have another series of canes that are emerging, kind of going outwards from those 3 to 5 canes. So overall, you have kind of this larger bowl-shaped plant of growth, and you're really pushing your growth on the outside. Again, we talked about all of those reasons. When you're making those pruning cuts in the springtime to do that, you actually want to paint the tip of where you made that cut. A lot of people use like nail polish, or you can use wood glue or something like that. There's something called the rose stem girdler. I think that's what it's called. And it will lay its eggs in that fresh wound, and the larvae will hatch and burrow down into the stem of the rose plant. So you're making a physical kind of barrier, not allowing that insect pest for doing that damage to your rose bushes. So anyway, I just thought that might be kind of interesting, but hopefully that gives you a little bit more information on roses.
Cool, thank you. This is a good one. What's the best pruning technique for butterfly bushes?
Okay, well, so butterfly bushes are something that you're not gonna probably be, they're not super duper dense. They don't tend to be, in my opinion. They have kind of, there are different types of butterfly bushes, but they have kind of smaller leaves, kind of more spaced throughout the plant. Of course, beautiful blossom production. So it's not one that I would necessarily recommend as like a hedging plant. I don't think it's an appropriate, again, the genetics of that plant of what I just described does not really lend itself well to being a hedging plant. Actually, this is a good one for me because I purchased my house a little over 3 years ago. And when I bought my house, I had a overgrown butterfly bush in my front yard that I would like to keep. It is about 10 to 12 feet tall, about 8 feet wide. It was getting a lot of sort of leaf and flower production on the upper portions of the plant, but I wasn't getting a whole lot of renewed growth on the bottom of the plant. Had some nice older, large diameter canes that the plant was growing from. So I think you see where I'm going with this. That's renewal cut, right? And we talked about that, of picking about the top 3 to 5 older, bigger branches and removing them at the base of the plant. And that's what I've been doing. I actually started the process last year. I finally got to it, and I took, mine is a larger plant, so I actually probably took about, well, 4 or 5 of the larger canes, and then I stopped. And I did get some height reduction on the plant when I did that too, because remember those older, larger canes tend to be the taller ones as well. So that's probably what I would recommend for butterfly bush.
Sounds good. And one thing we've noticed at the conservation garden, we've been planting a lot of the newer varieties of butterfly bush that are smaller and more compact. And we've literally just been pruning those to the ground. They seem to be pretty easy to maintain. So
yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up too, Sean. And I think that sometimes people are not aware that you have a lot of choices when you shop for plants. And, you know, I think lavender is a really good example of this. English lavender can get to be 5, 6, even sometimes 7 feet tall, which is a big plant in the landscape. course, there are all these dwarf cultivars on the market too that only get to be, 2-3 feet tall. So that, if you have a small space or you don't want the height, don't go with the standard English lavender. Go with one of those dwarf cultivars, because again, that plant's just going to fit that space so much better. So when you go and you're shopping, ask questions. If the plant is not the right size, don't go, well, it's okay, I'll just prune it, keep it small. Find out if there's a cultivar available on the market that actually is the correct size of what you need for the spot that you're looking to plant.
Yeah, and there's lots of new varieties on the market now. It's actually becoming a little overwhelming how many new varieties there are that are smaller or sized better for residential landscapes.
And I think that a lot of people can kind of get overwhelmed with that a little bit and go, I don't even know really where to start. You can certainly ask a knowledgeable nursery man or woman if there are any of the plants for sale that they know of that are or that are available. I'm going to go ahead and put in a plug too. This is really why you need to walk around places like Jordan Valley Conservation Garden Park or Red View Gardens, or wherever it is that or all of the above, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of these types of places are planting some of these newer varieties or these newer cultivars, and you can see them and you can see what they look like, and you can get some really great ideas sometimes of what would be a good choice for your landscape. So those places are really great for that, I think.
Next question. I have 30-year-old Pfitzer junipers as foundation shrubs, but they're as old dead growth. Will renewal pruning work for such old, overly tall shrubs?
Okay. Pfitzers are complicated. One of the things that we get into trouble with Pfitzers, no, I would not recommend renewal pruning for your Pfitzers. That is a really good example of one that you do not want to prune below the green growth. You could do a thinning cut on those Pfitzers, but if you're cutting below where you're seeing green, where you're seeing leaf production, that plant's going to have a hard time. It's going to look ugly. And it may die back, and it may take a really, or if it doesn't die back, it may take a really, really long time to look aesthetic in your landscape again. So I think you need to make a decision on those ones. If you want to keep them, then you can start doing some thinning cuts. Make sure that you stay above that green growth. You can get some height reduction that way, or some width reduction that way. Or if the plants just really are overgrown for that area, and thinning cuts are not going to get you the look of what it is that you want to accomplish, then you might want to consider taking them out and planting something else. Sean, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
yeah, I would say the Pfitzers, which are junipers, have kind of gotten a bad rap over the years, just because I think they were heavily planted for a while, and the older cultivars get really big. And get overgrown. And I think this is another example of buying newer varieties. There's some junipers that stay pretty small now, and then that don't overgrow their space. So
there's some really showy ones too. There are some beautiful variegated ones that have yellow variegation in it. There are some that have just a really beautiful kind of a grayish bluish kind of coloration cast, and so they can be really striking. I think sometimes people think that the only way that we add color to landscapes is by flowers, but that's not true. You can get really gorgeous foliage colors on plants. And I agree with Sean, some of the newer juniper varieties and cultivars, can provide this for us, that can be really striking and showy in the landscape. And then I also just want to point out too, with the junipers, we also have prostrate, or we have kind of ground creeping ones now too on the market that can be just a really amazing sort of a ground color. You can imagine too, with that coloration effect, they can really be quite striking. So
Yeah, I agree with that. And they're like almost zero maintenance, or as close to zero maintenance as you can get. So, which is nice.
Not fun to weed around sometimes, but
Yeah. Yep.
but they are water wise.
Okay, looks like we have a few more minutes here. This question has more to do with pruning shrubs based on blooming time. So the specific question is,
Okay.
if I do renewal pruning now on an earlier blooming shrub like a mock orange, will it still be okay for blooming on the branches that are left?
Yes. Yes. So with that blooming, and I'm sorry, maybe I felt like when I got to that, that part of the lecture, I was confusing myself a little bit. But when you have the early, just think about when those flower buds are being formed. When you have those early blooming plants, those flower buds are being formed right after those plants bloom. Okay. So that's why you wouldn't want to prune them during the dormant period, because you would be pruning off those flower buds. But what the question is if I do a renewal pruning, where I'm taking that entire branch back down to the base of the plant because I'm trying to, the older and the larger one, because I'm the height reduction or whatever it is, whatever reason we're doing the renewal prep, we don't really care about the flower buds that are on that branch that we're taking out. The branches that are left on that plant are still going to have those flower buds, and you're still going to get that flower production. Now, it may not be as showy. I will be honest about that. It could be, you need to be doing those renewal pruning cuts anyway. It might not be as showy because it could have been, remember we need good light penetration for flower bud formation. So it could have been that some of those taller, larger, older branches were shading some of the younger ones that were underneath it that were lower. And so there might be fewer flower buds on those branches that are left than those larger, taller ones that you're removing, because those ones were just getting better light access, light penetration. So you might not have as many flowers, but you still will have flowers. And you need to obviously be doing the renewal pruning anyway. So go ahead and do it.
Cool. This next question has more to do with identifying plants in their yard. Is there a good place or person that helps to identify plants in your yard that you inherited?
Yes. We do provide, we try not to go overboard with this with people. I mean, one great thing that you could do is snap some really good photos of the plants. You could take them to a nursery if you're talking to a knowledgeable nursery worker, and they could probably help you identify. I know that physically visiting places right now is a little bit tricky, but I'm not sure how you guys are doing things with Jordan Valley Conservation Garden Park, but those would certainly be considered knowledgeable folks that could probably look at some pictures really quickly for you and kind of help you to figure that out. We also too, we do provide a help desk, a gardening help desk through the extension service. You can email, we're closed right now to the public, we're by appointment only, but you can email us pictures, and that email address is mastergardener@usu.edu. So I don't know if Sean, if you don't mind like throwing that in chat or something, but mastergardener@usu.edu. We can't identify 100 plants in your landscape. We do handle a lot of inquiries throughout the year, but if you have a few that you're saying, I wonder if they could help me out with what that is, we could help with that. What helps us, it's really hard to identify stuff oftentimes in the dormant months. So now might not be a good time unless there's something really diagnostic about that plant that is like, oh yeah, that's totally what that is. Flowers help us to identify. Leaves help us to identify. Getting an not all the pictures close up to the plant, but doing one that shows the entire plant can help us to identify. And that is a service that's there to help the public with those types of questions. And so hopefully that gives you some places that you could start figuring out what you have.
Okay, maybe just one more question here. Let me look through what we've got. Let's see here. We have a lot of suckers on our cherry trees, and the roots are slightly exposed. There is also something white on the roots close to the base. Do you think this is a pruning issue?
Well, we will talk about fruit trees and suckering of fruit trees for the next talk. I don't know what the white stuff is. I have long learned in my 10 years of doing this that I never diagnose plant problems from verbal descriptions. This would be a great thing where you could take a high quality photo and email it to mastergardener@usu.edu. And we're happy to take a look at that and see if we can't help you identify what might be happening. The suckering is definitely, it's a sign of stress. I don't know if that tree, again, it depends on how the tree's being cared for. I don't know if that tree is being pruned for fruit production. We do get a lot of suckering in fruit trees because we do manage those plants so heavily. We do a lot of pruning on them because we want good fruit production. We want good height reduction. So they're kind of, in a lot of ways, exceptions of the rules. We kind of torture our fruit trees, to be honest with you. And as a result, they're not super long lived in the landscape. You know, fruit tree, life of a fruit tree, if it's heavily pruned to maximize fruit production, you may be looking at 30, 35, maybe 40 years. And then that's kind of the life of that tree, and you cut it down and you plant a new one. And that's just kind of the reality of it because of the way that we manage them. So we do see a lot of suckering because there is a lot of stress to the tree associated with how we manage fruit trees for fruit production. But there could be definitely other things happening as well. So which would be things like, you know, is it getting appropriately irrigated? Was there a lawnmower that did damage to the trunk of the tree? And we're seeing some of that stress resulting out of that. There are a lot of different scenarios that can cause trees to start suckering and throwing up that type of growth. So
yeah, and I think some of the problems could be from the tree being planted too deep initially. Could cause some of those issues too. So
yep.
And there's not really any way to correct that. So
you can always plant a new one.
Yep. That's a good point. All right. Well, thanks, Katie, for the presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us. The fruit tree pruning class will start at 10:30. So in about 13 or 14 minutes here, it'll be on the same WebEx session. So you don't need to leave this session and join a different one.